Hi all! This semester I'm teaching Existentialism, and today I would like to discuss Sartre's lecture called Existentialism is a Humanism. In this lecture, Sartre responds to the common objections raised against existentialism. Today, I would like to focus on one of his responses to the objection that existentialism is merely a subjective philosophy. It doesn't tell us how we should live our lives or what is a meaningful life. So his response to this objection is a bit puzzling because on the one hand, he says that when we make a choice, we should consider all humanity, which reminds us of Kantian ethics. On the other hand, he will reject Kantian ethics. So what does he mean by this response? That's going to be the focus of my talk today. So let's get started with clarifying some of the key definitions that Sartre makes in this lecture. First of all, Sartre points out the common feature that both Christian and atheist existentialists share. And both share the idea that existence precedes essence. This means that human beings do not have a predetermined function in order to lead a good life. For example, a function of a notebook is that we are able to write something on it, and we know that this is its function even before we produce the notebook. So some religions, as well as some philosophers, thought of a human being in the same way. For example, according to Aristotle, human beings have a particular function, and to the extent that we fulfill this function, we can flourish and lead a good life. Existentialists reject this idea. They think that first we exist and we continue to exist for some time, and then we define what is meaningful for ourselves or purpose for our lives. But it is important to note that Sartre is an atheist existentialist, but he is not an atheist moralist. Let's recall atheist morality with Euthyphro dilemma. In Euthyphro, Socrates asks the following question: is something good because God's commanded it, or do God's command that it is good because the thing is in itself moral and good? Atheist moralists say that the authority of moral principles cannot come from God because it is very hard for us to imagine a world in which immoral actions seem moral just because God's commanded so. Atheist moralists say that the authority of moral principles comes from the very fact that they are intrinsically moral. But Sartre doesn't subscribe to this kind of atheistic morality either. He says that just as Dostoevsky told us that if God doesn't exist, then everything is permitted, similarly, gods do not exist and we are abandoned in this world, so we have to make a choice for ourselves. So this concept of abandonment is something that he borrows from Heidegger, and to exemplify it, he gives his famous example from a student who is torn between ethical dilemmas. So the student is torn between whether he should join French resistance to act in the way he values, or whether he should stay with his mother. His brother is killed in the Second World War, so the only consolation left for his mother is him. So in this case, Sartre says that, well, like moral theories or scriptures do not really tell us what we should do. For example, consider Christian morality. Christian morality tells us to sacrifice ourselves for another or choose the harder way, which is really not clear which one is to sacrifice ourselves more or which one is a harder path. Kantian ethics tell us that we should never ever treat another person merely as a means, but if he stays with his mother, he might run the risk of treating his fellows merely as a means, and if he joins them, then he might be treating his mother merely as a means. So Kantian ethics doesn't tell us what we should do either. Well, to be clear, it's not the case that like moral theories do not tell us anything. Of course, utilitarianism says one thing, Kantian ethics says another, but it is us who will make the choice that like Kantian ethics is the right one or Christian morality is the right one. And this responsibility to take a to make a choice gives rise to anguish. He says that even Abraham felt this anguish because he's the one who has to make a choice whether to obey God or not, when God commanded him to sacrifice his son. So this abandonment and anguish go together. So Sartre says that humans are the source of a valuable life. We make something valuable by choosing it. So there are two ways to understand this claim, and one is very clear. So Sartre says that like we can value something if we act accordingly, if we choose it. So we can value to the extent that we act towards the goal we value. And that is a very plausible claim. The other claim is that human source is the only authority that for a valuable life, and that is a more problematic claim. So, for example, to test the truth of this claim, let's bump up the example and think of a serial killer. A serial killer also chooses a certain way of living, but we don't think that he chose something valuable for himself. Well, we could say that like he came to value what he is doing. He's killing people, and maybe he thought that this is valuable, but we wouldn't say that he chose something meaningful for himself or he chose something valuable for himself, which suggests that the valuable thing is independent of his choice. So Sartre might say that in response to these kinds of objection, whenever we make a choice, we should consider all humanity. But on the one hand, he already rejected Kantian ethics. And if he tells us that we should consider for all humanity, then it is really not clear what he means by this. I have two proposals to understand this claim. One of them is that maybe he just means that we should lead exemplary lives. So when I choose to study philosophy, I think that this is a good example for others to follow, but I'm not saying that everybody should choose studying philosophy. I'm just saying that, this is a valuable path that can set an example for others. I think Sartre might agree with this claim because he says that just as we invent art, we invent morality. So just as Picasso showed us that there is a certain way of perceiving or seeing things, when we choose morality, we choose a way of living, which might be a good example for others. A second way of interpreting this is that in order for us to make a meaningful choice, it has to be moral in the first place. That it is moral is a necessary condition for us to make a choice, but they are not sufficient for us to make a meaningful choice. Sartre might say that, there are moral actions out there, but they are not sufficient for us to make a meaningful choice. But I don't think he will agree with the second interpretation because he wants to insist that human beings are the only source of value and a valuable life. We cannot dictate them that this is externally a moral action or a moral way of living a life. It's important to note that Sartre doesn't say that we can never criticize each other's actions. Of course, we can criticize whether they are acting in bad faith or whether they are aware of their own real choices or whether they stay true to themselves, whether they are acting authentically, or whether they are aware of their own freedom. So we can criticize people on the basis of these facts, but we cannot tell them that this is a moral way of living, or this is an immoral way of living. But to the extent that he gives this response, it is really not clear why existentialism is not a subjective philosophy. Maybe Sartre, a third option is that he's assuming that we will always choose something good. So when we get back to the example from a student, the student is torn between good options. So maybe Sartre assumes that we will never choose something for the sake of its being bad. We will always choose among good things. So this is how I interpret Sartre's response. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me.